Welcome to Box Office Recap.
Today, I am going to explain the American drama thriller film called Stonehearst Asylum. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. At the beginning of the movie, an Oxford University professor demonstrates a case of female hysteria on Eliza Graves before his class. She protests that she is sane, but the professor mercilessly triggers her hysteria by touching her inappropriately. Any human touch sends her into a frenzied state. After the demonstration, he asks his assistant to bring in the next patient. Cut to Christmas Eve, a young doctor, Edward Newgate from Oxford, arrives at the Stonehearst Asylum. He is led by guards and the head of the guards, Mickey Finn, into the building. The asylum consists of 200 residents. Most of them are lords and ladies of the finest families of Britain. Dr. Edward is there to gain clinical experience for his further medical practice. He meets the superintendent of the asylum, Dr. Silas Lamb. Edward impresses Dr. Lamb with his will to work with the mentally challenged. So, Dr. Lamb invites Edward to the afternoon rounds with him. He introduces him to the patients of the Stonehearst. Some think they are animals, some delusional, while some of them are there for being homosexual. But one patient, in particular, catches Dr. Edward's eyes, Lady Eliza Graves, the woman shown at the beginning of the film. She is in the asylum getting treated for female hysteria. She belongs to a noble family and is married to a very wealthy man. Unfortunately, Lady Eliza suffers from hysteria. She reacts negatively to all physical touches. She bit her abusive husband's ear off. So, she was sent to the asylum by her father. Dr. Edward is fascinated by Eliza's musical skills. He seemed to have charmed her as well. Edward is surprised by Dr. Lamb's unique way of treating his patients. Rather than working on fixing their problems, he celebrated their conditions and allowed them to live happily in their delusions. Dr. Lamb invites Edward for a staff dinner that night. Many dishes lay etiquettely on the dining table. But Edward is surprised to see patients joining them on the table. According to Dr. Lamb, it is therapeutic for the patients to mix with the polite society. At the dinner, everyone is having cheerful conversations, until Dr. Edward mentions that Mickey Finn is a funny name. This causes tension in the dinner. Everyone goes silent, but Mickey Finn starts to laugh hysterically. He then offers Dr. Edward a glass of alcohol. He is about to drink it when Lady Eliza from below the table hits him with her legs. Doctor drops the liquor. Then, Eliza brings him out with an excuse of cleaning his shirt, and tells him to run away from the asylum as soon as he can. She gives no reason as to why. That night, Edward goes to his room confused. He prepares his gun in case he needs it in the future. A loud noise startles Edward. He follows it and reaches down to the basement. There are several people in prisons begging for his help. His first thought is that they are extremely insane patients, but after a chat with them, he realizes that they are the actual staff and superintendent of the asylum. Lamb was actually a patient who led a mutiny. He locked up the staff, and let the patients run things, including Finn. Among the prisoners are the actual superintendent of the asylum, Dr. Benjamin Salt, 2 nurses, a health guide, and many others. They were given a drink with some drugs and brought down to the basement. Edward realizes that he would have ended up like them if Lady Eliza hadn't saved him today. Horrified, Edward rushes to tell Eliza the truth. But she already knows all of it. In fact, she is one of the lunatics who helped Dr. Lamb imprison the staff. The next day, Lamb takes Edward and Mickey Finn with him on his afternoon rounds. They make Edward go into a lunatic's room to change his dressing. The lunatic is terrifying to look at. When Edward initially approaches him, he is attacked by the man. He is almost about to choke Edward to death, but soon, he notices the name Arthur written on the wall. Edward assumes that it is the lunatic's name, so he calls him Arthur. This finally calms the man down. Dr. Lamb is impressed, but Edward ends up with many injuries after the encounter. Lady Eliza looks after his wounds. Edward tells her about his intentions of freeing the prisoners and running away with them. At that time, she reveals that back then, Stonehearst Asylum was a cruel place for the patients, where they were experimented upon by Dr. Salt. His ways and ideas matched that of a devil's. Lamb, Mickey Finn, Eliza, the cooks, and the guards were all the victims of Dr. Salt's cruel method. He touched Eliza inappropriately to trigger her hysteria with an excuse of finding her a cure. He applied severe water pressure on some of his patients and kept them in the running water for days. According to Dr. Salt, a patient's worst fear is the way to cure their madness. But he struggled to find Lamb's worst fear. Dr. Salt performed all kinds of terrifying procedures on Lamb when he was a patient. Lamb and other patients had come to despise Dr. Salt, so they planned for months a way to free themselves of the torture. Finally, one day, They spiked the doctor and staff's drink and imprisoned them. Lamb took Dr. Salt's place as the chief of the asylum, and let the patients live freely. He employed some of them as the gatekeepers, some as cooks, and some as nurses. He gave all their life a purpose and made Stonehurst a happy place. After hearing the story, Edwards promises that she will never again have to suffer the way that she has. Shortly, Edward impresses everyone in the asylum. An old lady had refused to eat until her son comes from war. Edward poses as her son and lovingly feeds the lady. Seeing this encounter, Eliza is more drawn towards Edward. His kindness has impressed her. The pair starts to fall in love with each other. Edward tries to persuade her to run away with him from the asylum, but Eliza is doubtful of the idea. Not long after, Edward is called by Dr. Lamb. Dr. Lamb wants Edward to assist him in an experimental procedure on Dr. Salt. He ties him to the bed. Dr. Lamb claims that Dr. Salt is a lunatic who believes himself to be the rightful superintendent of Stonehearst, and he needs a therapy. This therapy is called electrotherapy. Then, in front of Edward, Dr. Lamb hits the switch, electrocuting him. He asks Edward to do the same. After the electrotherapy, Dr. Salt loses all of his memory. The next day is the new year 1900. Everyone in Stonehearst is celebrating and happy. Edward intends to set the prisoners free tonight. A ceremony takes place. Everyone is dancing as Dr. Lamb watches them. Elsewhere, Edward knows Dr. Lamb has some good inside him. So, he sets out to find it. In Lamb's room when he was a patient, Edward finds a hidden picture inside the wall, and takes it with him. Everyone goes outside the building to celebrate the coming of the new century. But Edward stays inside to spike the champagne with a chemical that will make everyone unconscious. However, Mickey Finn catches him in the act. After an intense fight, Edward frees himself from Finn. The spiked champagne is brought to the celebration and distributed to everyone. But as they are about to drink it, Mickey Finn stops them, and Edward's act is caught. Dr. Lamb hits him with a bottle. When Edward opens his eyes, he is tied to a hospital bed and is being taken into the electrotherapy room. Dr. Edward is about to be electrocuted as Dr. Salt did. Just then, Eliza comes into the room with Edward's pocket watch. It has a picture of Eliza on it. She assumes that her husband had sent Edward to get her out of the asylum. She asks him for his real intentions for coming into the asylum. He reveals that 6 months ago, he was in a medical lecture, where a doctor displayed Eliza and her medical disability. He felt so pitiful and saddened by her condition, he vowed to save her from that hell. This was the real reason Edward had come to the Stonehearst Asylum. As he is being taken away, he asks Eliza to run away from the asylum. Just as Dr. Lamb is about to electrocute him, Edward requests a final will. His request is to give Eliza Graves the picture that is in his pocket. But in reality, the picture is the one Edward had found in Lamb's room. Dr. Lamb takes a look at it, and he is shocked. The picture is the root cause of his madness. It is revealed that Dr. Lamb was a real doctor in the war. He had to kill his soldier friends to free them of the pain. He had shot each of them to death, and had tried to kill himself too, but he ran out of bullets. This turned him insane with time. The picture Edward showed him was the picture of one of Lamb's soldier friends. So, it triggered his madness again. Dr. Lamb runs away from there. Seeing this, Mickey Finn decides to perform the procedure on Edward himself. But Eliza comes to Edward's aid. The whole asylum watches them fight cheerfully. However, Finn triggers her hysteria by touching her trigger point, sending her into a frenzied state. Edward manages to calm her down. Then, the fight continues. Mickey Finn finally gets electrocuted and burns to death, but the fire spreads around and the room starts burning. Eliza runs to save the prisoners from the basement, while Edward goes looking for Lamb. He finds him in the hallway, out of his mind and deluded. So, Edward brings him outside with other patients. All of them are safe now. Everything is over. Edward wants Eliza to come to a new place with him, but Eliza refuses. They kiss their last goodbye, when Edward tells Eliza that he has a final secret to share. It is now a few months later. Stonehearst has become back to normal, and is better than ever. The true head nurse appears to be running things some time later, caring for the patients now, including Salt and Lamb. The Oxford professor from the beginning of the movie and Eliza Graves' husband arrive at the asylum to release her. But they are surprised to be informed that Dr. Edward had already discharged her 3 weeks ago. The men are surprised to hear this because the professor himself is Dr. Edward Newgate, the real Dr. Edward. He explains that the person who came here posing as a doctor was actually a patient of his. He had seen Eliza Graves in a medical demonstration at Oxford. Then he ran away from an asylum in London with Dr. Edward's belongings and stole his identity. All in order to save Eliza Graves. At the end of the movie, we see Mrs. Graves and the imposter Newgate in Tuscany, Italy. They are now known as Dr. and Mrs. Lamb. The two dance happily, and embrace in the garden of what appears to be another asylum, run peacefully by nuns. That's the ending of the movie Stonehearst Asylum. Now, for the explanation. Edward has been a mentally ill patient all along. He suffers from a condition called pseudologia fantastica, more commonly known as pathological lying. It is a condition where a person constantly lies for no personal gain. Edward had been doing this for years. We never come to know his real name. But despite of his disorder, he possesses the unique qualities of love and empathy. His love and empathy for mentally ill people like him made him able to help those people. Even Eliza's fear of touch is cured because of him. Because of this, Edward is able to act like a sane and normal person. The audience will not think that he is a madman. Edward's character is built very strongly. One of the messages conveyed from this film is about how great the power of love is. It is even capable of conquering the greatest human suffering, an insane soul.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more recaps and hit the bell icon for notifications.